Tywin Lannister stood at the highest window of the Red Keep's royal apartments, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed on the far horizon where the Blackwater Rush met the waters of Blackwater Bay. Although the aftermath of the war weighed heavily on King's Landing, he did not allow his tired eyes to stray toward the charred remains of old ships or the still flickering torches that lined the city walls. Instead, he surveyed the city as a tactician might observe a board of Cyvasse, evaluating every stronghold, every threat, and every potential ally. The war might have drawn to a precarious lull, but the real struggle, the one that had always mattered most, was just beginning. The battle of alliances, the forging of marriage pacts, and the dance of power that would define the future of the Seven Kingdoms. Rumors had circulated through the corridors of the Red Keep and the halls of Highgarden alike. The Tyrells had proven their loyalty to the crown, or to the Lannisters, rather, by the decisive turn of the tide at the Battle of the Blackwater, saving King's Landing from Stannis Baratheon's assault. The reward for that loyalty had initially manifested in the betrothal of Margaery Tyrell to King Joffrey Baratheon. But Joffrey's sadistic nature, coupled with Tywin's assessment that the boy king was ill-suited to keep the realm unified, had brought the plans into question. Tywin was too cunning, too practiced in the arts of statecraft, to leave so critical a matter to chance or to the whims of an unstable king. Within the damp and torchlit halls, servants spread quiet whispers of a different arrangement, a rumor that clung to the corners of the Red Keep as though it had its own pulse. Some claimed they had heard Tywin speaking in measured tones with Lady Olenna Tyrell herself. Others claimed Ser Kevan had carried secret messages back and forth between the Lannister patriarch and Mace Tyrell. No one could say for certain how it had begun, but by the time the rumor reached the common folk, it had taken shape as an astonishing possibility. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Hand of the King, might consider wedding the young Lady Margaery Tyrell himself. The notion was so shocking that, at first, even Cersei had scoffed at the idea. But Tywin, wearing his perpetual mask of composure, revealed nothing of his true intentions. He continued attending to matters of the realm by day, balancing the crown's ledgers, organizing the city's defenses, meeting with the small council, and, by night, he retired early, leaving most to wonder what his silence truly concealed. Margaery Tyrell arrived one afternoon at the Red Keep accompanied by her grandmother, the indomitable Lady Olenna, and her father, Mace Tyrell, in a swirl of green and gold banners. The young Tyrell lady possessed a beauty so poised and cultivated that even the grim atmosphere of the keep lightened momentarily. She glided across the courtyard where the King's Guard and Lannister men-at-arms stood watch. The courtiers and nobles who had gathered to greet her marveled at her grace, her genteel smile, and her readiness to dispense pleasantries. Though politeness dripped from every word, an iron resolve coursed beneath that polite exterior. She was a product of House Tyrell, after all, and the Tyrells knew how to grow power in a way akin to how they nurtured their gardens to full bloom. Margaery's thoughts remained measured behind her large, doe-like eyes. She had always known she was a piece on the board of noble alliances, first betrothed to Renly Baratheon, then passed along to Joffrey. In both cases, she had found ways to charm her intended betrotheds and to align their interests with those of her house. If the rumors were true, that the betrothal to Joffrey might be undone by Tywin's ambition, she stood at a crossroads far more consequential than any she had previously faced. Marrying Joffrey would have made her queen, though a precariously placed one, shackled to a vicious boy king. But marrying Tywin, the most powerful and calculating lord in Westeros, promised a different kind of influence, perhaps less outward pomp, but with far greater potential for shaping the realm's future. In the privacy of Lady Olenna's chambers, which had been hastily but lavishly appointed for the Tyrell matriarch, Margaery removed her gloves and listened to her grandmother's spirited condemnations of the Lannisters, their arrogance, and, ultimately, their necessity. If there was one thing Olenna Tyrell prized, it was ensuring her family's continued prominence in the realm. She found little good in the Lannisters, calling them gold-plated lions, whose sheen would wear off under enough scrutiny. Yet she knew quite well that if Tywin Lannister intended to make Margaery his bride, there were strategic benefits to be considered. Better an old lion than a mad cub, Olenna had said with a wry curl of her lips, when the idea was first raised in secrecy. Mace Tyrell had turned scarlet at the mere suggestion, but quickly came round once he weighed the potential fortunes for his house. Margaery, for her part, remained silent as her grandmother chattered. She was thinking of how Tywin had bested nearly every foe he had ever faced, how his cunning had preserved House Lannister's wealth and power through multiple rebellions, and how swiftly he crushed those who showed him defiance. Whatever an alliance with Tywin might cost, Margaery knew it would secure House Tyrell's place in the highest echelons of power. And if the arrangement was to her advantage as well, then it was a risk worth taking. The final negotiations took place under cover of darkness in the Tower of the Hand. Tywin sat behind his broad oaken desk. Opposite him sat Mace Tyrell, puffing his cheeks and trying his best to exude the dignity of a proud liege lord, but unable to hide his nervous glances at Tywin's steely features. Lady Olenna perched in a chair slightly to the side, tapping her cane impatiently. Ser Kevin watched from near the door, his expression carefully neutral. The subtle flicker of lanterns cast dancing shadows upon the walls, making the entire assembly feel like a secret tribunal rather than a wedding negotiation. When the terms were concluded, after hours of painstaking wrangling, both sides emerging with concessions and promises, Mace Tyrell mopped his brow and nodded his assent. Olenna's eyes held Tywin's in a silent, assessing lock, as if she were measuring the man's capacity for both cruelty and honesty. Tywin returned her gaze, and a faint twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth, his closest thing to a smile. It was done. Word spread quickly. The next morning, courtiers were astir, sending ravens to every corner of Westeros to announce that the new bride for the head of House Lannister would be none other than Margaery Tyrell, famed throughout the Seven Kingdoms for her grace and beauty. The wedding was scheduled to take place within a fortnight. Such was Tywin's determination to solidify the alliance. Joffrey threw a fit so violent that he practically needed to be confined to his chambers. Cersei grew cold and furious, spitting venomous words behind closed doors about her father's lack of propriety. But none dared openly oppose Tywin, not when the entire city still recalled how swiftly he had crushed Stannis' invasion, how deftly he managed the realm's affairs, and how fearsome his retribution could be against those who defied him. In the days that followed, Margaery's presence in the Red Keep became a daily fixture. She toured the wards where the wounded lingered from the Battle of the Blackwater, distributing small tokens of comfort. She visited the septs, praying for the realm and for a prosperous marriage. She hosted small gatherings in the castle's gardens, often joined by young ladies of the court who were already dazzled by her graciousness and subtle wit. Tywin observed these doings from afar, though more than once he had one of his men discreetly follow her steps, noting how effortlessly she won the admiration of the small folk and the courtiers alike. On one such afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith, Margaery strolled across the small gardens at the Red Keep, her olive-green gown embroidered with gold roses. She paused beside a hedgerow to brush her fingertips along the petals of a bright crimson bloom. The color reminded her of House Lannister's sigil, and she briefly wondered how her life would change once she was wed. The swirl of her thoughts was interrupted by the clearing of a throat behind her. She turned to see Lord Tywin himself stepping out from one of the colonnades, flanked by two of his guards who kept their distance once he indicated them to stay back. Margaery dipped into a curtsy as Tywin approached, and he inclined his head, acknowledging her courtesy in turn. For a moment, neither spoke. There was just the stirring of a gentle breeze over the carefully trimmed lawns and the distant sounds of city life beyond the fortress walls. "I see you've grown fond of the castle gardens," Tywin said at last, his tone more neutral than warm. "They lack the scale of High Garden," Margaery replied gently, "but they have their own charm. Each petal, each vine is tended so carefully, so precisely. I can see you value discipline in all things here at the Red Keep." Tywin permitted himself a small nod. He was not a man known to indulge in easy conversation. Discipline preserves order. Without order, everything else crumbles. Even gardens. Margaery smiled. "And does my lord enjoy gardens?" He looked at her, his pale green eyes as unwavering as stone. "I enjoy what they represent. A place where beauty is cultivated, not left to chance." Everything that flourishes in a garden does so because someone with knowledge and purpose allowed it to flourish. When I see a well-tended garden, I see governance on a miniature scale, each bloom in its proper place. She found his answer intriguing, if a bit characteristic. She wondered if he spoke only in political metaphors. Already she was learning how Tywin's mind worked, and it was becoming clear that, in his eyes, every detail was a resource to be harnessed. He was not an easy man, but Margaery did not fear him as many did. She recognized the power in him, and power had always attracted her. "I look forward to flourishing at your side then," she said, voice soft and respectful. "I hope I can bring some color to your carefully arranged garden of a realm." Tywin offered the barest tilt of his head and regarded her in silence. In his eyes, there was a glimmer of something that might have been respect. She was offering him her charms, not in a flighty manner but with carefully measured words, just as he preferred. "I have no doubt," he said, "that you will find ways to add your own influences." With that, he inclined his head again, then turned and strode away across the courtyard, his dark cloak rustling behind him. The subtle tension that lingered in the air told her enough. Tywin was determined to bring her into his sphere, but he would not yield an inch. Margaery had always thrived in such a dance, and she felt a tingle of anticipation knowing that, with Tywin, every conversation would be a subtle negotiation of power. When the day of the wedding arrived, King's Landing had done its best to shed the gloom of war. Merchants decorated their stalls with bunting, while men in Lannister crimson and Tyrell green patrolled the streets. Gossip abounded. Was Margaery Tyrell exchanging a chance at queenship for an alliance of calculated power? Did Tywin Lannister, so imposing and cold, truly wish to wed a bride so young? Did the Tyrells plan to surpass the Lannisters in influence once they were united? The great September of Baelor stood resplendent, its marble pillars lined with golden candelabras. Clusters of roses tied with ribbons of deep red adorned the pews. The High Septon, in his elaborate vestments, waited at the altar, his expression poised somewhere between reverence and curiosity. The who's who of the realm filled the pews. The remaining members of the small council, knights of renown, ladies from both Lannister and Tyrell houses, and numerous highborn guests who had managed to secure an invitation for this unprecedented match. Tywin arrived clad in a rich crimson doublet, the golden lion of his house worked into the fabric with delicate stitching. His presence turned heads at once. There was a gravity about him that hushed the murmurs. Walking with measured strides, he took his place near the altar, his face a mask of stern composure. Margaery's entrance stole every breath in the September. She wore a gown of white Myrish lace, overlaid with golden thread that formed a pattern of roses climbing from the hem to her waist. Upon her dark, flowing hair, a small diadem of gold and emeralds sparkled in the candlelight. As she proceeded down the aisle, escorted by Mace Tyrell, she offered gentle smiles to those on either side. From a distance, one might think she had the bearing of a saint or a queen. Her poise was as regal as any who had ever graced King's Landing. In those moments, Margaery allowed her mind to drift beyond the spectacle. She considered the vow she was about to make, the magnitude of binding her fate to a man who, though significantly older, commanded a respect rarely seen in the Seven Kingdoms. Even with her practiced composure, she felt a tremor of uncertainty. Would she be able to find her way into Tywin's guarded heart, if indeed he had one? Or was she content with a marriage founded purely on political advantage? The ceremony proceeded with solemn splendor. Their hands were bound with ribbons of red and green, and the words of union were spoken with customary reverence. Margaery's voice held a steady calm, while Tywin's resonated with the unwavering authority that had always marked him. When they turned to face the congregation, a soft sigh of relief and awe swept the crowd. The storm of rumor that had preceded the wedding felt distant now, replaced by the tangible weight of a new alliance. The wedding feast was held in the great hall of the Red Keep. Firelight danced across the polished floors, and the tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, honeyed hams, freshly baked loaves, and an array of sumptuous sweets shaped like lions and roses. Laughter and music filled the air, though it was subdued compared to the riotous feasts of King Robert's era. The memory of the war, and the knowledge that many still suffered in the city, put a damper on unrestrained revelry. Yet the Lannisters and Tyrells both ensured a lavish display, eager to demonstrate their shared prosperity. During the feast, Margaery moved gracefully from table to table, exchanging polite words with nobles who congratulated her and offered obsequious compliments. She responded with practiced charm, each smile measured and each remark carefully placed to please the ears of whoever listened. Tywin, meanwhile, presided at the head table, sipping wine with a deliberate air. He did not mingle as freely, but his mere presence, stern and dignified, was a statement in itself. The night wore on, and the delicate tapestry of alliances within the hall revealed itself more plainly. Various lords and ladies approached Tywin with hushed entreaties for favor, while others courted Margaery's attention, eager to see if she might influence the hand of the king to grant them certain benefits. Margaery handled them deftly, conferring flattery where needed, deflecting pointed questions with a sweet laugh or a gentle wave of her hand. When at last the feast concluded, and the final dance ended, Tywin offered Margaery his arm. They made their exit under a flurry of rose petals, signifying House Tyrell's blessings, and gold confetti, symbolizing the wealth and status of House Lannister. A new epoch had begun. The Lady of Highgarden was now Lady Lannister, wedded to the realm's most powerful lord. The early days of their marriage were a study in calculated distance and mutual observation. In the suite of chambers newly designated for Tywin and his bride, Margaery adapted to her new role. She was mindful not to step on Cersei's toes too aggressively, though she knew the Queen Regent harbored a simmering resentment. She was also wary of Tyrion, the sharp-tongued imp who seemed to observe everything with that disconcerting tilt of his head. Jaime was absent from King's Landing for the time being, which was a small mercy, for he might have complicated matters even further. Tywin spent his mornings in meetings with the small council, addressing the city's immediate concerns: food shortages, the expansion of the City Watch, the negotiations with foreign envoys. By mid-afternoon, he typically withdrew to his private chambers or the Tower of the Hand to review ledgers and correspondences. Margaery found ways to intersect with him at strategic times, offering a tray of refreshments, joining him briefly to talk of the realm's finances, or, on occasion, subtly suggesting new ways to win the loyalty of the people by philanthropic gestures. At first, Tywin's responses to these suggestions were brief and to the point, neither discouraging nor openly embracing her ideas. Yet, bit by bit, Margaery noticed small changes. A food distribution program was expanded upon her urging. A donation of royal funds went to repair a damaged sept in Flea Bottom, a move that earned Tywin grudging praise from the High Septon. When Margaery mentioned to him that maintaining the loyalty of the faith could be crucial, Tywin blinked once and moved on to the next topic. But a few days later, she heard that a large donation of gold had been made to the faith in the name of King Tommen, in the event that Joffrey should fail to hold the throne. Slowly, her suggestions were bearing fruit, though Tywin never credited her openly. In private, their relationship grew into a guarded companionship. Tywin was not a man for romantic overtures, nor was Margaery naive enough to expect them. But she found moments to draw him out of his shell, appealing to his sense of legacy or praising the success he had brought to House Lannister. Her intelligence and political acumen did not go unnoticed. If Tywin was a fortress guarded by high walls, Margaery was a patient infiltrator, finding the discreet postern gates. He respected competence above all, and she provided it in measured doses, hoping he might come to rely on her counsel. The nights in their bedchamber carried their own rhythms, at times an exercise in duty, at others marked by unexpected warmth. Margaery discovered that Tywin, while not gentle in the conventional sense, possessed a restrained intensity. He was as exacting in intimacy as he was in war or politics, giving no quarter to frivolity, yet revealing a deep undercurrent of pride and possession. There were nights when he seemed almost to study her reactions, as if measuring how best to keep her loyalty. She responded in kind, weaving compliments and subtle touches, ensuring he felt admired and respected. A worthy partner, not just a political necessity. Over time, they developed a quiet, mutual understanding, though it was built more on negotiation and a shared love of power than on any romantic affection. Beyond the confines of their chambers, the realm continued to present challenges. Joffrey's moods had worsened after being denied Margaery's hand, and Cersei struggled to contain his caprices. He grew erratic, punishing servants for the smallest mishaps, lashing out at Tyrion in the throne room, and sneering at Margaery whenever they crossed paths. Tywin intervened rarely, preferring to let Cersei manage her son. But after a particularly vicious outburst in which Joffrey nearly struck one of Margaery's handmaidens, Tywin summoned his ensign to the Tower of the Hand for a private lecture. No one knew exactly what was said, but Joffrey emerged pale and trembling, and the next time he saw Margaery, he offered a stiff bow. For a moment, Margaery glimpsed the terror in his eyes that Tywin's threat must have instilled in him. She felt relief, knowing that Tywin's authority might shield her from the worst of Joffrey's wrath. Yet she recognized this arrangement was precarious. Joffrey was a wild dog, barely muzzled, and only Tywin held the leash. The people of King's Landing, meanwhile, gradually warmed to Margaery. Her charitable visits and well-chosen statements made her a darling among the small folk, and she was hailed in whispers as the Rose among the Lions. Her marriage to Tywin lent her the gravitas she had never quite possessed when she was betrothed to Joffrey. Now she had the ear of the real power in the realm. Her grandmother, Olenna, took pride in Margaery's success, but also reminded her that the Tyrells had their own ambitions, and Margaery's loyalty to House Lannister should never overshadow her loyalty to her birth family. The Tyrells began to move more confidently in King's Landing, establishing deeper roots. Loras Tyrell joined the Kingsguard, a high honor that also served to keep him close at hand. Mace Tyrell tried to exert influence on the small council, proposing laws to benefit the Reach. Olenna Tyrell busied herself by forging alliances with various lords and ladies, her sharp wit cutting down enemies and ingratiating friends. In short, House Tyrell capitalized on Margaery's new status to strengthen their hold in the capital. Some among the Lannisters bristled at the Tyrell influx. Cersei, in particular, saw Margaery as a threat. She whispered that Margaery was an opportunist, a cunning manipulator who would eventually try to outmaneuver Tywin himself. And yet, for all her grumblings, Cersei dared not confront Margaery openly, not with Tywin's patronage looming in the background. Tyrion maintained a wary neutrality. He found Margaery charming and recognized her intelligence but remained cautious, as he was with anyone who courted power. The weeks stretched into months, and the realm slowly stabilized under Tywin's iron-fisted governance. With the Tyrells as staunch allies, the crown no longer teetered on the brink of bankruptcy. Trade routes reopened, and new fleets were commissioned to protect merchant vessels. The scars of the Blackwater still marked the city, but reconstruction efforts moved along faster with Tyrell gold and Lannister cunning. Meanwhile, Tywin strategized relentlessly to quell any further rebellion, whether from the remnants of Stannis' forces or scattered threats in the Riverlands. Margaery used these months to study Tywin's modus operandi. She observed how he handled vassals, noting the measured punishments he doled out to those who disobeyed, the discreet rewards he granted to those who showed loyalty. She discovered the network of informants he maintained in every major region, learning that Tywin's knowledge of local affairs often exceeded that of the local lords themselves. It was a masterclass in rulership, and Margaery absorbed it like a sponge. Late one evening, in the private solar adjacent to their chambers, Margaery joined Tywin at a small table cluttered with ledgers and half-rolled scrolls. A single candle sputtered beside them, illuminating the lines of accounts that Tywin was reviewing. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Should you need assistance, my lord husband, I can help collate the figures." Tywin glanced at her hand before regarding her face. "You've been busy in the city. It's late. You need rest." She gave a slight shrug, smiling softly. "I find rest difficult when I see you burdened by so many tasks. If we are partners in the governance of the realm, let me ease some of that burden." His eyes narrowed fractionally in appraisal. He slid one of the ledgers toward her. "These are accounts of the crown's debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos. I am cross-referencing them with loan statements and shipping manifests to ensure no sums have been overlooked or misappropriated. If you can verify that the amounts match, it would be of help." Margaery nodded, taking a quill and beginning to go through the columns. The two worked in a companionable silence for some time, with only the crackling of the candle and the distant hush of the night air as accompaniment. When Margaery looked up, she found Tywin's gaze resting on her. "You take to it easily," he said, with something akin to approval in his tone. She bit back a grin, not wanting to appear too pleased. "It's simple mathematics. Our stewards at Highgarden always demanded thoroughness in such matters. But I thank you for the compliment." Tywin dipped his head briefly. "I would not have expected a lady of your station to be well-versed in finances, though perhaps I should have guessed differently, given what I know of your grandmother." Margaery answered with a knowing smile. "Lady Olenna believes knowledge of coin is just as vital as knowledge of courtesy or swordsmanship. She taught me to read ledgers and keep accounts from a young age, saying that a house that fails to track its gold is a house on the verge of ruin." Tywin's expression grew thoughtful. "Your grandmother is a formidable woman, and you are following in her footsteps. I see it in how you navigate the court. Even Cersei has found no advantage over you, though that may be partly because I advised her not to test you." This was a rare moment of openness from him, and Margaery decided to seize it carefully. "I appreciate that, my lord, but I also believe part of our success lies in mutual respect. I don't seek to threaten Cersei's position as Queen Regent. I only wish to fulfill my role as your wife, ensuring the stability of our family and the realm." Tywin inclined his head slowly. "Perhaps you have found the correct approach. Many have tried to supplant the existing order with force or trickery, and they have all faced ruin. You, on the other hand, seem to prefer to weave yourself into the tapestry of power. It's a shrewd strategy." Margaery returned her attention to the accounts, but her mind hummed with the significance of his words. It was the closest thing to a genuine compliment she had yet received. In that silent moment, she realized that Tywin was not averse to the idea of leaning on her capabilities more openly, and that this door, once slightly ajar, might open further if she proved herself indispensable. Over time, Margaery's role in the politics of King's Landing began to crystallize. She organized charitable functions, improved relations with the faith, and liaised with her Tyrell kin to ensure a steady flow of supplies. Tywin, for his part, allowed her a measure of freedom to act, though he carefully kept watch to ensure she did not overstep. Cersei continued to seethe, but her grievances fell on deaf ears. Tyrion took a more nuanced approach, occasionally exchanging polite barbs with Margaery at court functions, each testing the other's wit. Loras, bound by the white cloak, often stood guard near Margaery, ensuring she was never isolated at court events. This subtle presence reminded everyone that the Tyrells were no lesser partners in the alliance. As the months rolled into a year, rumors of the Union's success circulated across the Seven Kingdoms. Lords in the Riverlands and the Westerlands spoke in hushed tones about how Tywin and Margaery were systematically consolidating power. In the north, ravens carried messages to and fro, some insisting that a new status quo was forming, that with Tywin's iron will and Margaery's astute social cunning, House Lannister might become more entrenched than ever, overshadowing even the memory of House Targaryen's once unassailable rule. The question of an heir also surfaced. Already, some gossips whispered that Tywin wished for Margaery to bear him a new son, one who might inherit Casterly Rock. Others wondered if Margaery would prefer to remain childless, focusing on forging her own path without the complications of motherhood. However, neither Tywin nor Margaery discussed the matter publicly, leaving the court to speculate. In private, Margaery knew that Tywin did indeed want a child from the marriage, a new hope for House Lannister's legacy untainted by Joffrey's cruelty or Tommen's gentle innocence. She weighed her own position. A child would irrevocably tie her to Tywin's lineage, ensuring her place in the annals of the Seven Kingdoms. It would also strengthen the bond between their houses, fulfilling Olenna's dream of unbreakable ties. One day, while strolling through the gardens, Margaery confided her uncertainties to her grandmother. Olenna sniffed the air with her usual impatience. "Child, you do not question whether flowers bloom in spring. They simply do so when the season is right. If this is the path that secures our family's future, and your own, then you must walk it. But never forget, a child is a tool as well, in the Game of Thrones. Margaery nodded thoughtfully, feeling the cool breeze rustle her hair. She imagined what it would be like to bear Tywin's child, to bring a new Lannister rose into the world. Part lion, part Tyrell. Would the child be as relentless as Tywin, or would he or she inherit Margaery's softer touch? The prospect was daunting, yet laced with possibility. The realm soon demanded more attention. Rumors reached King's Landing that Balon Greyjoy, Reaver of the Iron Islands, had died, and his brother Euron had seized the Seastone chair. Ships bearing the sigil of the Kraken prowled the western coasts, threatening raids. Tywin responded with characteristic decisiveness, dispatching naval forces and commanding that the Shield Islands be fortified. Margaery watched how swiftly he acted, how meticulously he allocated funds for the navy while still keeping enough gold in reserve. She realized that Tywin's success lay not just in ruthlessness but in an uncanny ability to balance aggression with caution. Meanwhile, Stannis Baratheon, though battered at the Blackwater, had not vanished. Reports indicated he was regrouping on Dragonstone, forging alliances with men who still believed in his claim. The Red Woman's ominous presence loomed in hushed whispers. Tywin did not fear Stannis in open battle, but the threat of shadowy sorceries tugged at the edges of the Lannisters' plans. The Iron Throne was not secure while a Baratheon still plotted for it. To bolster the crown's legitimacy, Tywin orchestrated a grand tournament in King's Landing, intending to dazzle potential allies and remind the realm of Lannister, Tyrell might. The best knights and lords from across Westeros were invited to compete for glory, gold, and recognition. Margaery took on the role of hostess, planning the feasts and entertainments, ensuring that each visiting lord felt welcomed. Pavilions in Lannister red and Tyrell green dotted the fields, and the city came alive with the bustle of jousting participants and merrymakers. At the tournament's opening ceremony, Margaery sat beside Tywin in the royal box. The crowds erupted in cheers when the king, still Joffrey, for the moment, took his seat. But the applause for Tywin and Margaery was significant, a testament to how the small folk recognized the real power behind the throne. Margaery responded with demure waves and pleasant smiles, while Tywin sat in stoic grandeur. The justs began in earnest. Loras Tyrell, resplendent in his white Kingsguard armor, unseated night after night, his prowess undiminished. But the real chatter stirred when, on the second day, a black-armored mystery knight arrived, challenging any who dared ride against him. The knight bore no sigil, only a black shield, and his visor remained lowered. One by one, challengers fell. Whispers circulated. Was it the Hound returned? Was it some champion from Dorne, seeking to test his skill? Even Joffrey leaned forward in fascination. At last, the Black Knight faced Loras Tyrell. The entire crowd tensed with anticipation. Margaery felt her heart pound, knowing her brother's pride was at stake. The initial clash resounded with a tremendous crack of lances. Both riders kept their seats. The second pass was equally fierce, splinters flying everywhere. On the third pass, however, the Black Knight shifted his aim at the last moment and struck Loras just below the tilt of his shield. With a gasp, Loras tumbled from his horse, landing hard upon the ground. A hush fell over the stands. Margaery stood abruptly, her hand clasped to her mouth. She saw Loras stir, then rise unsteadily, knocked breathless but seemingly not gravely hurt. The Black Knight remained mounted, tilting his visor in silent acknowledgement. Then, as if the entire realm were watching in suspended awe, the knight dismounted and approached the royal box. No one moved. Silence gripped the air. Tywin gestured for the knight to speak. Slowly, the knight lifted the visor, revealing a face that only a few recognized at first glance. A young man with sandy hair and a determined jawline. His voice was clear as he addressed Tywin and Margaery. "I beg pardon for arriving in secrecy, my lord. I simply wish to test my skill without the burden of a name. I hail from Tarth, and I bring a message of peace and caution from the Stormlands." Whispers broke out, and the hush gave way to a buzz of speculation. Though the name Tarth conjured images of the Sapphire Isle, no one could recall if this man was connected to Lord Selwyn Tarth. Margaery watched Tywin's expression remain unreadable. "You have proven your skill, sir," Tywin said, pausing for a name. The knight bowed. "Ser Garin Tarth, my lord. I have come to offer my services to the crown, if you would have them. There are rumors of dissatisfaction in the Stormlands, and men speak openly of riding for Stannis. My father is loyal, but we see the winds shifting. I would ensure House Tarth stands firm with the Lannisters and Tyrells." Tywin studied him with an intensity that made Margaery think of a hawk studying prey. "Well spoken, Ser Garin. We shall discuss this in a more private setting. For now, your victory in the lists has earned you the champion's purse." The crowd erupted in cheers. Margaery felt her tension ease, relieved that Loras was uninjured. She cast her brother a supportive smile, though she saw in his eyes the sting of defeat. The Black Knight, Ser Garin, collected his winnings and humbly departed, leaving a swirl of curiosity in his wake. That night, in the privacy of their chambers, Margaery and Tywin exchanged observations on the day's events. She asked if Tywin trusted Ser Garin's intentions. Tywin sat before the hearth, methodically removing his gloves. "I trust that he wishes to be on the winning side. His reasons may be genuine or he may be a spy. Either way, I'll see if he can be of use before discarding him." Margaery watched the flames dance in the hearth, considering the constant intrigue that pervaded every corner of their existence. "And what of the Stormlands? Is there a real threat that more lords will rally to Stannis?" Tywin exhaled in mild exasperation. "Stannis remains a nuisance, not a force that can topple the crown so long as the Tyrells and Lannisters remain united. We must ensure no fracture forms. You and I are the linchpin of that union." For a moment, Margaery heard a hint of vulnerability behind his words. They both knew that alliances in Westeros were fickle, that any sign of weakness could undo everything they had built. She approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We will ensure no fracture occurs. House Tyrell stands with House Lannister, and so do I." He turned to face her, eyes reflecting the firelight. "I believe you, Lady Margaery," he said quietly. And then, in an uncharacteristic show of affection, he raised her hand to his lips for the briefest moment. She felt a warmth spread through her, not necessarily love but a sense of partnership, of shared ambition that had evolved into something like mutual trust. It was a feeling she had not anticipated when this marriage was first brokered, and she recognized it as a powerful bond in its own right. As the realm settled into a wary peace, Tywin's focus increasingly turned to solidifying alliances with distant regions. A raven arrived from Dorne requesting a trade delegation to discuss the distribution of resources. Another arrived from the Vale, bearing word that Peter Baelish was now Lord Protector there, a development that could mean a cunning new foe or a potential ally. Tywin gave each matter his meticulous attention, weighing the benefits and costs. Margaery found opportunities to participate in these deliberations, carefully positioning herself to voice opinions that might sway Tywin's decisions. She recognized that a new synergy was forming between them. When Tywin was set on a course of action, she might temper it with a gentler approach. When he hesitated on a delicate matter, she offered a nudge in the direction that would ensure stability for the city or for House Tyrell. It was a constant balancing act, but one that she performed with grace. Then came the evening when Margaery decided to broach the subject of an heir directly. They were in the privacy of their chambers after a long day of council meetings. Tywin was seated at his desk, scanning through a stack of letters. Margaery approached slowly, her hands folded in front of her. "My lord husband," she began in a calm voice, "may I speak with you on a matter that weighs on my mind?" He looked up, placing the parchment aside. "Of course." She took a breath, preparing her words. "We have forged a strong alliance, and the realm has grown more stable under your leadership. Yet the future is never certain, especially in Westeros. I believe it may be time for us to consider the prospect of an heir, one that would secure our house for generations to come. Tywin regarded her with a measured expression. I have considered it. Cersei's children stand as the next in line to the throne, and Tommen might be molded into a proper king. Joffrey lacks the qualities I would wish for in a ruler. But what exactly do you propose? I propose that we create a lineage of our own, Margaery replied carefully. A child of both Lannister and Tyrell blood who could, in time, lead a unified Westeros. Not necessarily to supplant Tommen, but to provide further stability should anything befall the Baratheon line. Tywin leaned back slightly in his chair. The flickering lantern light cast stern lines across his face. Such a child would indeed unify our two great houses, more deeply than any betrothal. She lowered her eyes in a show of respect. I will not push you if you have reservations, but I believe a child would solidify our place. I am prepared to do my duty. Tywin was silent for a moment, his gaze distant, as though seeing beyond the walls of the Red Keep into the future. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than usual. Yes, the time is ripe for such a plan. Our enemies are regrouping, waiting for any sign of weakness. A new heir would show them that House Lannister does not rely solely on the outcome of Joffrey's reign. Margaery exhaled, feeling a sense of relief and resolution. She nodded, crossing the room to stand near him, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. Then let us take that step, and let us show the realm that the lion and the rose stand strong together. He covered her hand with his own, neither smiling nor frowning. So be it. In the weeks that followed, Margaery made subtle changes to her routine, consulting with maesters and midwives discreetly. Tywin, true to his Natu, did not make any grand announcements. He merely continued to govern, albeit with a faint edge of satisfaction that only those closest to him might discern. Cersei grew more suspicious as rumors circulated that Margaery was taking tonics to aid fertility. Yet she dared not confront her father openly. Tyrion, ever watchful, offered polite nods when he encountered Margaery, but his searching gaze suggested he was piecing together the underlying strategy. When at last Margaery's courses did not come, she confided the news to Tywin in private. He received it with composed acceptance, though Margaery thought she glimpsed a flicker of genuine pride in his eyes. Word soon spread throughout the court, generating a wave of whispered excitement and speculation. King's Landing found itself once again swept up in curiosity. A new Lannister heir, but sired by Tywin himself from a Tyrell mother, what impact would this child have on succession, on power balances, on the future of the entire realm? And so, as Margaery navigated her pregnancy, under the watchful eyes of midwives and the unwavering vigilance of Tywin's guards, King's Landing braced for the next chapter. The War of the Five Kings had shattered the realm, but from its ashes, Tywin and Margaery were deliberately crafting a new era of Lannister-Tyrell dominion. One evening, as Margaery lay on a chaise in their solar, sipping a calming tea brewed with lemon balm and chamomile, Tywin entered and sat beside her. He studied her face, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. "You're certain you're well? The maesters have no concerns." She smiled at him. "None. They say everything is progressing normally." A pause stretched, during which Margaery wondered if Tywin would voice any deeper sentiment. Finally, he spoke. "I've ordered additional guards to your chambers, and Cersei has been informed that you are not to be disturbed without my express permission." Margaery's lips curved into a small grin. "That is most reassuring. I appreciate your consideration." He inclined his head. "This child will be the symbol of our alliance, the living embodiment of our ambition. I intend to protect that symbol at all costs." She nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her features. "And our child will also be a person, not just a symbol, my lord husband. Perhaps, in time, we can grant them a life that doesn't revolve solely around politicking and war. After all, a leader might benefit from some measure of happiness and humanity." Tywin did not reply immediately. He seemed to reflect on her words as he stared into the low-burning hearth. Eventually, he exhaled. "Perhaps so. We shall see if the realm grants such luxuries." In that moment, Margaery felt a faint tenderness, as though Tywin were allowing her a glimpse past the fortress walls of his heart. It was fleeting, but enough to assure her that there might be more than just cold calculation underlying this marriage. They were forging something new, built on ambition and necessity, but not entirely devoid of understanding. As the months wore on, Margaery's pregnancy became more apparent, and the city's mood softened toward her. People whispered that she was a blessing to House Lannister, that she was taming the old lion in ways none had believed possible. Others muttered that she was the real power behind the throne, using her delicate touch to manipulate Tywin to do the Tyrell's bidding. The truth, Margaery knew, was more complex. She and Tywin had become partners in a grand game of governance. She recognized his authority, and he valued her cunning. Each day, the bond between them grew more pragmatic, yet more rooted in mutual respect. Cersei remained distant, her eyes flickering with envy whenever she observed Margaery's growing belly. Joffrey sneered less openly now, perhaps cowed by Tywin's earlier threats. Tommen, sweet and amiable, always offered a shy smile to his grandfather's new wife, though he seemed a bit mystified by the changes in the family. Tyrion, perhaps the only one who truly saw the complexity of it all, remained polite and watchful. He occasionally visited Margaery, inquiring after her health, always with a hint of sardonic humor. "I do hope the child inherits your temperament," he once remarked, "though that might be too much to ask for with my father's blood in the mix." In turn, Margaery teased him back, "He'll inherit the best qualities of both families, I'm sure." Through it all, Tywin stayed as busy as ever, orchestrating the affairs of the realm. New threats cropped up like weeds. The Ironborn stirring along the coasts, Stannis rumored to be dabbling in darker magics, and the uneasy stirrings in the north where rumors spoke of White Walkers, though few in King's Landing truly believed them to be anything more than superstitions. Tywin took each challenge as it came, fortifying alliances, dispatching envoys, and ensuring no one in the realm could amass enough power to challenge him. And at his side, Margaery grew more certain of her position. She had set out to be more than a passive bride or a mere token of alliance. She had become a force, subtle yet unyielding, weaving her influence through the city, the court, and, ultimately, through Tywin himself. One crisp afternoon, as winter began to nibble at the air, Margaery stood on a balcony overlooking the city. Her belly, now quite rounded, pressed against the smooth railing. She gazed upon the rooftops and winding streets, hearing the distant calls of merchants and the clang of smiths' hammers. Even with the memory of war lingering, King's Landing was alive and vibrant. In that moment, she felt a surge of determination. She wanted to preserve the city from further chaos, to shape a future where the lion and rose thrived together, for the sake of the child she carried. She sensed a presence behind her. Turning, she saw Tywin approaching quietly. He wore a heavy cloak lined with fur against the cooler weather. Standing beside her, he, too, surveyed the city below. "Much remains to be done," he said, as if reading her thoughts. Margaery nodded. "Yes, our enemies are not idle." Tywin placed a hand on the railing, fingers curling around the cold stone. "This child will be born into a safer realm than the one torn by the War of the Five Kings, if I have anything to say about it." She rested a hand lightly on her stomach. "And I will do everything in my power to help you achieve that. Together, we can bring about a reign that endures, not for personal glory alone, but for stability, prosperity, perhaps even peace." He eyed her for a moment, and she wondered if he would scoff at the notion of peace. Instead, he said, "Peace is won by strength. No peace ever endures without a show of force behind it. But if you can temper that force with compassion, then perhaps we can achieve something meaningful." She offered him a gentle smile, warmed by the realization that their philosophies, though different, could complement each other. He was the iron fist. She was the velvet glove. Together, they might actually craft a legacy that outlasted their lifetimes. As the final months of Margaery's pregnancy ticked by, the city awaited the child's arrival with mounting anticipation. Tywin ensured the maesters were on constant alert, and Olenna Tyrell arrived with a retinue of Tyrell midwives, determined that her granddaughter would want for nothing. Even Cersei seemed grudgingly respectful of the fact that a new Lannister heir was imminent, though she maintained an aloof distance. Each night, Margaery felt the unborn child's movements grow stronger. She would lie awake, hand on her belly, imagining the future. A future where her child stood at the pinnacle of Westerosi society, guided by both Tywin's ruthless intelligence and Margaery's empathetic cunning. She imagined unity across the Seven Kingdoms, alliances that endured through storms and rebellions. She pictured grand feasts where the houses of Westeros gathered not for war, but for celebration. Tywin, for his part, grew more present in her day-to-day life. He insisted on updates from the maesters and inquired regularly about her comfort. Though he wore his usual calm facade, Margaery sensed a current of paternal protectiveness stirring within him. It wasn't tenderness in the typical sense. Tywin remained too reserved for that, but it was a quiet, resolute devotion to the well-being of his wife and their unborn child. In the midst of this, the undercurrents of Westerosi politics did not cease. Letters arrived weekly describing tensions in the north, with rumors of wildling invasions and strange sightings beyond the wall. From the Vale, Lord Baelish sent cryptic messages professing loyalty yet hinting at complicated intrigues. And always, there was the question of Daenerys Targaryen across the Narrow Sea, who some claimed was amassing an army to reclaim her birthright. Tywin treated each piece of intelligence with calm scrutiny, bolstering defenses where needed, making fresh alliances, and always ensuring the crown remained solvent and secure. At last, in the 10th moon of her pregnancy, Margaery's labor pains began. It was late at night, and Tywin was already abed, though his sleep remained as light as ever. He heard her stir, noted her hushed intake of breath, and was at her side immediately. Servants rushed to summon the midwives, and the bedchamber became a flurry of activity. Candles were lit, hot water was brought in, and maesters bustled around, offering potions and reassurance. For hours, Margaery labored. She endured the waves of pain, focusing on her breathing, on the encouraging words of Lady Olenna, who hovered like a hawk. Tywin stood at the periphery, his composure unbroken, though his eyes never left Margaery. Through the haze of contractions, she caught his stern gaze and saw in it a silent promise that she was not alone. At dawn, the cry of a newborn echoed through the halls. Margaery exhaled in relief, tears of exhaustion and joy wetting her cheeks. The head midwife swaddled the child, a boy, and presented him to Margaery and Tywin. Tiny fists waved weakly, and his bright eyes struggled to adjust to the morning light. Margaery reached out, taking the child in her arms. She felt her heart swell, an overwhelming rush of protectiveness and wonder. Tywin stood at her shoulder, peering down at the infant. For a fleeting moment, she saw the mask slip, replaced by a grandfatherly softness. Yet here he was a father once more. "He's strong," the midwife murmured. Lady Olenna let out a small, trembling laugh. "Oh, he's a fine boy. Congratulations, my dear." Margaery looked up at Tywin, her eyes shining. "My lord husband, behold your son." The old lion nodded, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "He will be raised as a true Lannister. He will know discipline and pride, and he will hold the keys to our future." Margaery smiled, though tears still shimmered in her eyes. "And he will also learn mercy, compassion, and the power of alliances. He will be the rose as well as the lion." Tywin regarded her with a silent look that carried more emotion than any words he might muster. Around them, the attendants stood in reverent hush, and in the corridor, a ripple of excitement spread as word of the child's birth traveled through the Red Keep. The next day, the city rang with bells to celebrate. Courtiers lined up to pay homage, each seeking to be among the first to offer congratulations. Cersei wore a forced smile, though her eyes burned with envy. Joffrey sneered and stalked off to torment a servant. Tommen, sweet child that he was, clapped his hands in delight at having a new uncle. Tyrion arrived with a wry grin, offering a jest about the future Lion of Highgarden. but his voice carried an unmistakable note of genuine goodwill. In the days that followed, the newborn's name was announced: Tywin Lannister. Tywin's name fused with a subtle nod to the Tyrell lineage that now coursed in his veins. The realm took note, and ravens flew out to every corner of Westeros, proclaiming that the Lannister legacy had gained a new heir, one who might stand astride a future no one yet could fully foresee. For a time, amid the upheavals of wars and plots, there was a calm within the Red Keep. Margaery recovered from childbirth, devoting herself to nurturing Tywin. Tywin continued the relentless work of governance, but he often visited his son, examining the infant's small fists and solemn eyes with an inscrutable expression. Margaery saw in Tywin a chance for the realm to change, to outgrow the endless cycles of vengeance and feuds. She whispered lullabies to the child, telling him of a brighter future, one in which the Seven Kingdoms might truly be united. She told him of the many houses he would one day guide and how he must learn to listen as well as to lead. Tywin, standing in the doorway, overheard her gentle promises. He said nothing, but a faint furrow creased his brow, as though he pondered a future he had never truly dared envision. A Westeros not just held under the iron grip of House Lannister, but perhaps genuinely forged into a place of greater prosperity. Their marriage, which had begun as a cold, calculated pact, was evolving into a formidable partnership. Margaery's knack for winning hearts worked in concert with Tywin's genius for strategy. Together, they presented a united front to any who would dare challenge them, and through the unspoken harmony of their efforts, the realm slowly stabilized in ways it never had under the tyranny of petty kings and fractious lords. Yet whispers in the shadows continued. Names like Stannis, Euron, Baelish, and Daenerys Targaryen hovered like phantoms, reminding them both that peace was tenuous. Even as Margaery nurtured new life within the Red Keep, forces beyond the city's walls stirred restlessly. Winter edged closer each day, and no one could dismiss the possibility that dark forces in the far north might one day threaten them all. Still, for the moment, Tywin and Margaery savored the fragile lull. She watched her husband command the realm with unmatched resolve, saw how the lords and ladies deferred to him, how even the High Septon offered blessings without argument. And Tywin, in turn, recognized the quiet power his young wife wielded, how her every smile could melt hostility, how her philanthropic gestures swayed the small folk, and how her cunning suggestions in private shaped his policies to appear more benevolent than they might otherwise be. Each evening, they would reconvene in their solar or bedchamber, discussing the day's events while a lullaby sounded from the next room where Tywin slept. Their words sometimes touched on the child's future, sometimes on new challenges that had arisen, but always there was a sense that they were forging a legacy. They were not naive. They knew storms would come, yet together, they felt prepared to weather them, lion and rose intertwined. Thus, the saga of Tywin Lannister and Margaery Tyrell's unlikely marriage found its first fruition. From the fires of a brutal war, a new alliance had emerged, pragmatic, strategic, and, in its own careful way, nurturing a flicker of hope. The question that lingered, unspoken yet ever-present, was whether even the formidable combination of Tywin's iron will and Margaery's diplomatic brilliance could reshape a land so deeply scarred by conflict. For now, at least, they held the realm in a steady balance, aware of the burdens yet to come. The city's bells had heralded a new beginning, if only the kingdom might hold onto it. And in the softly lit corners of the Red Keep, where a child's cry would occasionally echo, a new chapter of power and promise began to unfold, shaped by the hands of two of the most formidable figures ever to play the Game of Thrones. The arrival of Tywin Lannister changed the atmosphere within the Red Keep in ways both subtle and profound. Margaery felt the shift first, in the gentle hush of conversation as she carried her infant son through the corridors, in the sudden warmth of a few of the older servants who looked upon the swaddled babe with eyes that had once known only fear. It manifested in how some of the courtiers now bowed just a bit deeper when they greeted her, as though acknowledging that she was no longer simply the clever Tyrell Rose who had wed the formidable Lord Tywin Lannister, but now the mother of a newly minted scion who carried the blood of both the Reach and the Westerlands. The most striking transformation, however, was in Tywin himself. He did not suddenly gush with affection or adopt the manner of a doting father, for no one who knew him expected such a thing. But a faint softening shadowed his stern features whenever he gazed upon Tywin. It was not an everyday occurrence, nor was it something he would allow the realm at large to witness. Still, on certain nights, after his council meetings and his reading of ledgers and reports, he would quietly slip into the nursery, where Margaery might be rocking their son or laying him down to sleep. There, Tywin would linger by the cradle. Occasionally, he would brush a calloused finger against the child's cheek, as though trying to fathom the enormity of having fathered another heir so late in life. There was pride in him, a profound sense of final accomplishment, tinged with the knowledge that he had done his utmost to secure House Lannister's legacy. Margaery, watching these moments from a small distance, realized that her work had only just begun. All the cunning she had employed to cement her place in the Red Keep, to ward off Cersei's jealousy, and to negotiate the labyrinth of King's Landing's politics, had led her to this juncture. Now she had to nurture not only Tywin's growth but also the delicate balance of power that kept the Lannisters and Tyrells united in cause and in marriage. The entire city had become a place of quiet expectation, as though waiting to see how this formidable alliance between the Old Lion and the Southern Rose would steer the realm's course. Yet the Seven Kingdoms did not rest easily. Within a fortnight of Tywin's birth, fresh tidings arrived that Euron Greyjoy had wasted no time in consolidating his control over the Iron Islands. Rumors circulated that he had commissioned the construction of a great warship, black of hull and crewed by men with an appetite for terror. Whispers said the ship's prow was carved into a ghoulish kraken figurehead, and that Euron had sailed it to distant, unknown lands before returning with a chest of strange artifacts. More practical intelligence stated simply that Euron intended to strike at vulnerable points on the Westerland's coast to test Tywin's mettle. One by one, small fishing villages and lightly guarded ports reported sightings of sails bearing the Golden Kraken. Though no major landings had yet occurred, the tension along the coastline was palpable. Tywin received these reports with cold detachment. He immediately ordered the Lannister fleet to be bolstered. Shipwrights in Lannisport and King's Landing were set to labor day and night, building galleys sturdy enough to chase down the swift iron-borne longships. Orders were sent to the Shield Islands near the Mander to heighten their alert, ensuring that the Tyrell holdings were equally protected. Ravens flew between Casterly Rock and Highgarden, establishing a joint naval strategy that would keep the coast safe. If Euron was testing the realm, Tywin intended to test Euron in return. Margaery, meanwhile, found herself quietly delighted to discover that Tywin openly included her input in certain discussions regarding the Tyrell fleets. She would sit in on private meetings held in the Tower of the Hand, or sometimes in their solar, carefully cradle. Ing Tywin, while Tywin, Ser Kevan Lannister, and even a few high-ranking Tyrell bannermen conferred about patrol routes and resource allocations. Her grandmother Olenna had often insisted that a wise ruler must concern themselves with every aspect of governance, and Margaery took those words to heart. She had no illusions that Tywin sought her counsel out of sentiment. He simply recognized her innate skill in forging alliances, her deep familiarity with the Tyrell network of lords, and the beneficial effect her presence had on bridging any distrust between the Lannisters and the Reach. Outside these strategic discussions, the Red Keep continued its usual hum of intrigues. Cersei carried herself with an aloofness that bordered on open resentment. She performed her duties as Queen Regent beside her unpredictable son, King Joffrey, but she scarcely attempted pleasantries with Margaery. Tyrion maintained a watchful distance, though he showed sporadic kindness toward Margaery, particularly if he believed he could glean new insights from her regarding Tywin's intentions. Tommen, the youngest child of Cersei, offered Margaery the sweetest smiles whenever their paths crossed, though he remained largely overshadowed by Joffrey's presence. And Joffrey himself seemed to have receded somewhat from daily affairs, spending more time tormenting underlings or hosting private hunts with his favored knights, as though the birth of Tywin, coupled with the city's worshipful view of Margaery, had stolen some of the attention he craved. In the broader realm, events began unfolding in ways that tested the newfound stability Tywin and Margaery had built. Tales from the Narrow Sea hinted that Daenerys Targaryen, the exiled princess with 3 living dragons, had conquered cities in Slaver's Bay. Although she was half a world away, The memory of Dragonfire still lingered in Westerosi lore, reminding everyone how swiftly such power could reshape a continent. Tywin was skeptical that Daenerys could ever mount a successful invasion, given her precarious base of power and the complexities of shipping an army across the sea. But he did not dismiss the threat entirely. He ensured that spies in Pentos and Volantis sent regular updates, detailing any mention of ships being purchased or an alliance with the powerful merchant fleets in the Free Cities. Just as critical was the matter of the North. News trickled down of continued skirmishes near the Wall. Wildlings under Mance Rayder were rumored to be massing in numbers never seen before. Reports claimed that the Night's Watch had barely staved off a large-scale incursion, and there were ominous references to white shadows and dead men walking. Most in the capital dismissed these stories as ravings from the frozen wasteland. Tywin himself was not a man to dwell on ghost stories. He considered the wildlings a threat mainly if they managed to cross the Wall in large numbers, in which case they would ravage northern lands and eventually run into the new Warden of the North, whomever the crown ultimately named, once the region stabilized. But the North remained unsettled. House Bolton had taken over Winterfell in the aftermath of the Ironborn occupation, and a sense of dread emanated from there. While Tywin was more than willing to let the Boltons rule with fear, as it kept the rebellious Northerners in line, Margaery found the rumors disquieting. She had once heard from Sansa Stark, before Sansa vanished from court, that the Boltons were rumored to flay their enemies. Margaery took no joy in alliances earned through terror, but she knew that confronting them outright might unravel everything. Each day, she weighed the cost of ignoring the rumors against the cost of interfering in the North's complicated politics. For now, Tywin's official stance was to let them maintain order, as House Stark had been effectively reduced to scattered exiles and fugitives. Weeks rolled by and winter's chill advanced, though it was still mild in King's Landing. Margaery spent much of her time in the nursery, caring for Tywin, or attending audiences with ladies of the court who had grown enamored of her gentle style. She listened to their entreaties, their gossip, and their offers of loyalty. Often, these visits were accompanied by small gifts for the newborn, embroidered blankets, wooden toys, carved lion figurines. Margaery accepted them graciously and used the opportunity to strengthen personal ties with lesser houses from all over the kingdom. She had a keen awareness that every ounce of goodwill she cultivated would eventually be tested, and she wanted each corner of the realm to remember the generosity of Margaery Tyrell Lannister. Tywin grew quickly, as infants do. His hair showed hints of a pale gold, reminiscent of the Lannister side, though Margaery's darker eyelashes framed his blue-green eyes. Many commented that he was a comely child, lively and quick to giggle when tickled under the chin. Servants whispered that he might one day inherit more than just titles. A temperament combining Tywin's cunning with Margaery's charm could make for a formidable leader. Of course, there were some who saw in the child another potential threat to Joffrey's tenuous throne. But Tywin made it explicitly clear, through a few carefully placed remarks, that Tywin was not meant to usurp Joffrey. Rather, the child stood as a symbol of the deeper union between the Lannisters and Tyrells, a separate line of inheritance that could well outrank Tommen or Myrcella, or any lesser claimants, if events turned sour. The boy had an attendant of his own, a quiet, sharp-eyed man named Ser Balman, assigned as his personal guard. Though not as famous as the King's Guard, Ser Balman had proven himself loyal in the wars, and Tywin trusted him to keep watch over Tywin's cradle day and night. Margaery appreciated the gesture, knowing that with Joffrey's unpredictable moods, no measure of security was too great. She herself kept a close eye on the household staff, ensuring that any who approached Tywin directly were thoroughly vetted. She might have been known for her gentle ways, but Margaery was not naive about the dangers that could lurk within the Red Keep's walls. During this relative lull, Margaery found moments of peace. She would sit in the Queen's ballroom when it was empty, sipping tea and listening to distant seabirds. She often reflected on how different life might have been had her first betrothed, Renly Baratheon, prevailed. She thought about how fleeting political fortunes could be, how swiftly the tides changed, and she understood, more than most, the price that came with power. The perpetual awareness that any misstep could unravel the delicate tapestry she had worked so hard to weave. Her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, was never far from mind or earshot. The Queen of Thorns remained in King's Landing, installed in comfortable apartments that overlooked the castle's gardens. Olenna would occasionally summon Margaery for private talks, delivering frank advice in her cuttingly direct style. While Olenna was pleased at how well Margaery had integrated herself into Tywin's sphere, she also reminded her granddaughter not to lose sight of the Tyrells' broader ambitions. If the Lannisters ever faltered, House Tyrell must be poised to step forward. But Olenna also saw some glimmers of genuine respect forming between Tywin and Margaery, if not something that might, in another couple, be called affection. Olenna teased Margaery about taming the old lion, which Margaery accepted with a knowing smirk, well aware that Tywin would never be truly tamed. One late afternoon, a raven arrived from Dragonstone. The raven carried a black wax seal, indicating it came from a source close to Stannis Baratheon. The letter was addressed to the Lady Margaery Tyrell Lannister, a curiosity in itself. Sensing potential mischief, she brought the unopened letter to Tywin's attention. Together, in the quiet of their solar, they examined it. The letter contained a single sheet of parchment. Its contents were surprisingly civil, though laced with Stannis's typical righteous undertone. He insisted that the Iron Throne remained rightfully his and that the Lannisters' hold on King's Landing was a perversion of justice. However, the letter's main thrust was an offer. If Margaery truly wished for peace in the realm, she might persuade Tywin to step aside from propping up a bastard line of Baratheons. In exchange, Stannis promised clemency for House Tyrell, even reaffirming their dominion over the Reach. He ended with the somewhat chilling assurance that the Red God's justice waits for all who cling to false kings. Tywin read the letter twice, his expression unmoved. "He's becoming desperate," he said at last, placing the parchment aside. "Stannis knows that as long as we hold the capital and have your house's support, his claim is nothing but a wraith-haunting Dragonstone." Margaery tapped a finger on the table. "Yet he reached out to me specifically. Perhaps he hopes that I might be swayed by his offer. Once, after all, I was betrothed to Renly, his brother." Tywin gave a curt nod. "He's playing on old sentiments or attempting to, but he underestimates you. Or me. There will be no discussion with that man unless he surrenders unconditionally." "What should we do in response?" Margaery asked, arching an eyebrow. "Ignore him entirely, or craft some reply?" Tywin steepled his fingers. "A short reply, perhaps, acknowledging receipt, rejecting the notion, and affirming that any aggression against the crown will be met in kind. But let us not stoop to scorn or mocking. We gain little by inflaming him further." He paused. "If you wish to pen the response, do so, but be sure it's concise." Margaery dipped her head in agreement. It was a small gesture of trust on Tywin's part, allowing her to speak for their household. She composed a measured letter, neither insulting Stannis nor entertaining his propositions. She simply wrote that she stood firmly beside her lord husband and that the crown recognized no claims but those already sanctioned by the laws of the realm. By the time she finished, Tywin approved the wording with a single nod and sent the missive off by Raven. That same evening, Margaery's mind turned to the question of how Stannis might try to persuade others within the capital, particularly those who chafed under Lannister rule. She considered how to shore up their base of support, not only with coin but with small gestures that might go a long way in winning hearts. With Tywin's cautious blessing, Margaery organized a series of charitable events aimed at feeding the poor in the city, still recovering from the War of the Five Kings. She arranged for surplus grain from the Reach to be distributed in Flea Bottom at reduced prices. She also commissioned local tailors, paying them a fair wage to mend the cloaks and garments of orphans. None of it was a grand philanthropic revolution. Tywin would never authorize draining the treasury for such efforts, but it was enough to keep the small folk from forgetting that they had a benevolent figure in the Red Keep who cared for their welfare. As these distributions took place, word spread through the streets that it was Lady Margaery's initiative. The presence of House Tyrell banners at the distribution sites served as a potent reminder that the alliance between the Reach and the Westerlands was still strong. On more than one occasion, Margaery ventured into the city with a modest escort, speaking gently with the people, taking their measure and receiving their gratitude. She did not bring Tywin along. He was far too young, and she would not risk his safety. But she did speak of him, remarking with soft pride that she hoped her son would grow up in a realm at peace, a realm prosperous enough that no child went to bed hungry. Such remarks spread on the lips of every fishmonger and seamstress in King's Landing. For the small folk yearned for security and a ruler who understood their struggles. Despite the measured sense of calm that prevailed, tension continued to flicker beneath the surface. Tywin received cryptic letters suggesting that Peter Baelish, newly made Lord Protector of the Vale, had begun weaving plots that might extend beyond his mountainous domain. Baelish was rumored to have contacts as far as Braavos, and he had always been skilled at manipulating coin and alliances to his advantage. Tyrion, in particular, voiced concern over Littlefinger's scheming, recalling all too well how the man played factions against each other. Yet Tywin was more wary than afraid. Baelish might pull strings in the background, but the Vale was no direct threat so long as the Lannisters and Tyrells stood united. Then, on a chill morning when the fog hung thick over Blackwater Bay, a pair of battered fishing skiffs arrived at the city's main harbor. The fishermen wore haunted looks as they were brought before the gold cloaks. They told of encountering ironborn reavers farther up the coast, 2 longships flying a black banner with a golden eye rather than the standard kraken. The fishermen claimed the ironborn crew had boarded them, demanded gold, and boasted that Lord Euron himself was preparing a bold raid. The men only escaped because the ironborn had found their cargo worthless and let them go with a warning. Tell your Lannister overlords that their time to sink or swim draws near. When these reports reached Tywin, he wasted no time in dispatching more ships from the royal fleet to patrol the area. The news was troubling, if not entirely unexpected. Euron Greyjoy had clearly decided to test the West Coast's defenses. Tywin considered a preemptive strike on the Iron Islands but hesitated. Committing a large enough force to subdue the Isles might leave the capital vulnerable. Instead, he wrote to the Greyjoy bannermen who had once sworn fealty to the crown, offering them handsome rewards if they betrayed Euron's cause or provided intelligence. Meanwhile, he coordinated with House Tyrell and House Redwyne to keep the seas around the Mander well guarded. Margaery, who had no particular love for the ironborn reavers, expressed concern about the cost in ships and men. If Euron's boldness escalates, we might find ourselves drawn into a full-scale campaign, she pointed out as they dined one evening in their private quarters. We've only just begun to rebuild the crown's finances after the war. Tywin pinned her with a thoughtful look. Our finances will recover better if we nip threats in the bud. A war on 2 fronts against Stannis and the Ironborn would be costly indeed. But if we allow Euron free rein to raid our coasts, the losses in trade and loyalty might exceed the cost of a decisive intervention. She nodded, conceding the point. Have you considered entreating any other major houses for naval support? He pursed his lips. The Arbor's fleets are already pledged to us through the Tyrells, and they are the largest aside from the royal fleet itself. Dorne has some ships, but their strength lies in land forces and desert defenses. They're unlikely to commit heavily at sea unless it benefits them directly, and our relations with Dorne remain lukewarm. We have not forgotten how they resent the fate of Princess Elia during the sack of King's Landing. Still, I've sent cautious overtures to Sunspear inquiring about potential cooperation or at least neutrality should conflict intensify. Margaery agreed with the strategy. Doran Martell was known to be patient and calculating. If there was a gain for Dorne, he might join. The question was what Tywin could offer that would placate Dorne's old grievances, something not easily remedied by gold alone. Winter's approach continued to grow more palpable, and the days shortened. The nights brought harsh winds off the bay. Margaery sometimes felt the chill seeping into the stone walls of the Red Keep. It was her first real taste of the colder seasons in King's Landing. Previously, she had only ever seen the city in sunnier times, or in the aftermath of war. Now, she witnessed how the common folk fared when trade dwindled and the harvests from the Reach slowed for the season. She saw more beggars at the gates, more orphans in the alleys. She countered this as best she could, but she knew that only so much could be done. In the midst of these conditions, a traveling envoy from the free city of Braavos arrived, seeking an audience with the hand of the king. Tywin, mindful of the crown's debts to the Iron Bank, granted them a formal reception in the throne room. Margaery stood beside him during this audience, a stately presence in a gown of deep red velvet embroidered with gold roses near the sleeves, a subtle blend of the two houses' colors. The Braavosi envoy, a tall, lean man with graying hair and a braided mustache, introduced himself as Margaery Zalanero. With him were 3 associates dressed in dark purple robes, each wearing an iron brooch in the shape of a coin. Margaery greeted them with a courteous bow, then expressed hope for the continued repayment of the crown's outstanding debts. Tywin assured him that the crown would honor its obligations as scheduled. Margaery, with the reserved politeness of a diplomat, then mentioned that the Iron Bank always kept a close eye on conflicts that might threaten the stability of the realm. Conflicts such as those stoked by the Ironborn, or by any other claimant who might reduce King's Landing to chaos. He inquired whether House Lannister would be interested in securing additional lines of credit to protect shipping lanes, or to finance a more robust naval expansion, guaranteeing safe trade in the future. Tywin answered with careful language, neither rejecting nor embracing the offer. But Margaery watched the envoy's expressions and realized that the Iron Bank saw an opportunity. Braavos profited when the seas were safe, for it meant more commerce, more payments, and fewer defaults. On the other hand, if war threatened, the Iron Bank sometimes found ways to back whomever seemed likely to uphold their contracts, or whomever might pay them best in the long run. She knew that Tywin would not lightly commit to new debts, but the entire exchange stood as a reminder that even though the realm seemed more unified than in recent memory, many forces beyond Westeros's shores watched with calculating interest. After the audience, Margaery and his associates were offered a short tour of the Red Keep. Margaery, at Tywin's request, hosted a small luncheon for them in a smaller hall adorned with gold and crimson banners. Though the talk was polite, Margaery could sense the Braavosi's subtle probing for any signs of instability or tension at court. She kept the conversation light, focusing on how the city was recovering from wartime devastation and how trade with the Reach had stabilized food prices. She made a point of praising House Lannister's swift actions in securing shipping routes, all to convey that King's Landing, under Tywin's leadership, was not about to crumble. That night, as she relayed her impressions to Tywin, he commended her deft handling of the situation. "They need to see that the crown is a solid bet," he said, pouring wine into a pair of silver goblets. "Any whiff of weakness, and they'll either call in debts early or sponsor a rival. Braavos is too powerful to antagonize needlessly." Margaery sipped her wine and nodded. "The Iron Bank has a reputation for always getting its due. We should ensure they have no cause to doubt us. But we must remain cautious about taking on new loans." Tywin agreed, setting his goblet down. "Indeed, I won't mortgage the realm's future to appease a foreign bank. If I manage this carefully, we can keep them at arm's length, paying off our current debts while avoiding new entanglements. But they do have their uses if Euron grows more dangerous, or if Stannis tries something bolder." The mention of Stannis drew Margaery's mind back to Dragonstone and the letter she had penned. She wondered if, in some future scenario, Tywin might consider a brazen strike on that volcanic island. For now, though, Stannis was isolated, with few bannermen of any real consequence since his defeat at Blackwater. If he gained strength again, it would likely be through desperate measures, perhaps forging alliances with men of questionable repute, or trusting more fully in the Red Priestess and her rumored sorcery. Each time Margaery allowed herself to dwell on the notion of magic in warfare, she felt a chill run through her. The War of the Five Kings might have been brutal, but at least it conformed to the mortal constraints of swords and sieges. Sorcery was an unknown variable that could shift the balance of power in ways no one could predict. Autumn shifted inexorably into winter, and the stark lines of bare trees in the royal gardens were a testament to the changing season. Margaery found that Tywin preferred the warmth of the Solar's hearth. He was no longer a tiny infant now. At 8 or 9 moons old, he could sit up with assistants and babble in that charming, nonsensical way of babies. He reached for objects, and his bright eyes followed any new face with keen curiosity. The nurses assigned to him were chosen carefully by Margaery, but even they were not allowed to be alone with him for too long without the presence of Ser Balman. Each day, Tywin's personality emerged a little more. He had a tendency to grab hold of a person's finger with a resolute grip, refusing to let go. Margaery teased Tywin that he showed the Lannister stubbornness already. Sometimes, if the sun was warm enough, Margaery would carry Tywin to the small courtyard, letting him see the sky and watch the fluttering pennants overhead. Occasionally Tywin accompanied them, though he often stood back, observing the scene with a nearly imperceptible softening in his stern visage. These glimpses of paternal warmth were fleeting but genuine, reminding Margaery that, in his own formidable way, Tywin cared deeply about this new child, and, by extension, cared about her continued well-being. Such domestic moments were soon interrupted by an unsettling development. One morning, a dispatch arrived from the Shield Islands. It reported that a large Ironborn fleet had been spotted off the southwestern coast, dangerously close to the main shipping lanes that fed King's Landing and the Reach. The local lords had scrambled their meager defenses, but the numbers were daunting, at least 10 longships, possibly more, flying some variation of the Kraken or Euron's rumored personal sigil, an eye crowned in black iron. The message concluded with an urgent request for reinforcements and an ominous note that captured sailors had spoken of a storm of crows and darkness that Euron allegedly invoked. Superstitious nonsense, in Tywin's view, but still a sign that Euron was dabbling in fear as a weapon. Without delay, Tywin summoned his war council. Margaery attended, standing at his left shoulder with the baby in a nurse's arms just outside the chamber. Ser Kevan Lannister, imposing knights of the Westerlands, and a few Tyrell captains from Highgarden huddled around a large table draped with a map of the coasts. They discussed how best to respond, the men's voices low and urgent. Some advocated a direct confrontation, dispatching the royal fleet in full force. Others suggested a more measured approach, setting traps by feigning vulnerability, then ambushing the Ironborn near shallower waters. Tywin listened to each viewpoint, occasionally letting his gaze flick to Margaery, who offered subtle nods or frowns to indicate her thoughts. Eventually, a plan took shape. A portion of the royal fleet, reinforced by Tyrell and Redwyne ships, would sail from King's Landing and from the Arbor to create a pincer. They would not attempt a hazardous open-sea battle if they could avoid it. Rather, they would funnel the Ironborn into narrower channels where the bigger war galleys could outmaneuver them or force them against rocky shores. Meanwhile, the Lannister coastal garrisons would be put on high alert in case Euron tried a quick landing. Although it was risky, Tywin concluded that ignoring this threat would invite disaster. Better to confront it decisively, at a time and place of their choosing, than allow Euron to strike at will. That evening, Margaery and Tywin sat for a meal alone in their chambers, the flicker of candlelight reflecting on polished silverware. She could sense the tension in him, how his mind churned with the logistics of the impending naval engagement. She set her fork down and spoke softly. "I've heard the Ironborn can be cunning in ways we don't expect. They strike at night, use the tides to slip past heavier ships." Tywin leaned back, arms folded across his chest. "True, they've been a scourge on the western coasts for centuries, but they're pirates at heart, ill-suited for a protracted conflict. Once they face a strong enough reprisal, they typically retreat." She toyed with the stem of her wine cup. "That was under Balon Greyjoy, and we saw how that rebellion ended. But Euron is said to be more ambitious, more unpredictable. And ambition can be dangerous when combined with skill." A faint frown etched Tywin's brow. "I won't deny Euron is a problem, but he will not go unchecked. Our fleets outnumber his if we unite with Highgarden. This is precisely why we nurtured the Lannister-Tyrell alliance." Margaery smiled, though it was a reflective one. "Yes, and I find some reassurance in that. Still, I'll pray for our sailors and soldiers." A brisk knock on the door cut short their conversation. Tyrion entered, wearing a coat of fine black leather and a somewhat serious expression that replaced his usual flippancy. He bowed stiffly. "My lord, my lady, I apologize for the intrusion, but I've just received news from our friend in the Stormlands, Ser Garan Tarth, the one who unseated Loras in that tournament. He's uncovered something I thought you should hear immediately." Tywin gestured for Tyrion to continue. Margaery's eyes flicked between the two men as Tyrion explained that Ser Garin had intercepted a series of coded letters intended for Dragonstone. While the contents were partially deciphered, they suggested that an alliance might be forming between a band of Stormland's knights loyal to Stannis and certain smugglers who had ties to the Iron Islands. If the rumor held any water, it meant Stannis might be quietly funneling resources to Euron: gold, supplies, possibly even knowledge of King's Landing's vulnerabilities, in exchange for a maritime pact that would disrupt the Crown's dominion. Tywin's jaw tightened as he listened. Stannis stooping to an alliance with the Ironborn? That would be the height of desperation. And the Ironborn typically have no love for any mainland lord. Tyrion shrugged. Desperation breeds strange bedfellows. If Stannis thinks the city can be sacked from the sea while his forces harass the crown from the Stormlands, well, we've seen more ludicrous plans succeed with enough cunning. Margaery felt a stir of worry. Euron may not care about Stannis' claim, but if it allows him to sow chaos, and perhaps seize key coastal fortifications, he might go along with it. Tywin's eyes remained fixed on Tyrion. How confident is Ser Garin in his intelligence? Tyrion glanced at the parchment he carried. He seems certain that something is afoot, though the exact scale remains unclear. He requests further instructions, and possibly additional gold to dig deeper. Tywin exhaled, then looked at Margaery as though considering the best course forward. We will dispatch a reliable messenger to Ser Garin. Authorize whatever funds he needs within reason. He's to continue his infiltration and confirm the extent of Stannis' involvement. Margaery's mind raced, thinking of how multiple threats now converged. Euron's fleet and Stannis' unyielding claim, possibly working in tandem. It felt as though the realm was teetering once more on the brink of open conflict. She asked quietly, "Should we inform the Tyrells or the small council immediately?" Tywin paused. "We'll share enough to keep them vigilant, but I want confirmation before raising an alarm that could panic the court. Half the lords in King's Landing would flee at the merest hint of another war, and I won't have chaos descend upon the city again." Tyrion nodded, slipping the parchment back into his coat. "I'll draft the letters tonight." After the dwarf departed, Tywin and Margaery exchanged a long look. She reached over and gently rested a hand on his. "We've weathered storms before," she said. "We can do so again." His lips formed a tight line. "Yes, but I'll not underestimate a cunning foe. Stannis proved resourceful once, nearly taking the city. And Euron is an unknown quantity. We must be prepared for multiple fronts." Margaery squeezed his hand once, then withdrew, understanding how he needed space to think. She felt tension in her own chest. The coming months might decide whether the foundation she and Tywin had built would endure, or be swept away by fresh tides of war. Days turned into weeks as the Crown's fleets coordinated with Tyrell and Redwine vessels, preparing for a confrontation with Euron. Scouts ventured along the coastline, seeking signs of Ironborn movement. Skirmishes were reported near the Shield Islands, where a handful of Lannister and Tyrell ships managed to repel smaller raiding parties. Each engagement left behind battered hulls and wounded sailors, fueling the sense that a major battle loomed just beyond the horizon. Within the capital, King Joffrey feigned interest in the looming threat, occasionally donning his regal attire to proclaim that he would lead the fleet himself if necessary. Few took him seriously, recalling his cowardly behavior at the Blackwater. The practical leadership fell, as always, to Tywin. Cersei continued her attempts to bolster Joffrey's image at court, while seething at the knowledge that Margaery and her infant son earned more genuine affection from the people than the boy king did. Tyrion, in his capacity as master of coin, juggled funds to keep the crown afloat. He allocated sums to shipbuilders, to the city watch, to bribes for intelligence, all with the slight cynicism that he sometimes confided only to Margaery. "I wonder," he mused one afternoon, "whether all the gold in Casterly Rock and Highgarden can buy us lasting peace, or if we're only buying temporary reprieves before the next war." Margaery had no easy answer, so she simply responded, "Perhaps peace is always temporary, but the lengths we go to secure it define who we are." Tyrion acknowledged her words with a pensive nod. "If that is so, then we'd best make sure we do everything possible. The next generation, your son, among others, will inherit the consequences." Amid these heavy concerns, Margaery still found fleeting pockets of warmth. She sang lullabies to Tywin, paced through the garden corridors with him in her arms, and introduced him to small wonders: a bright tapestry, a gilded mirror, the cooing of doves in the rafters. Each discovery widened the child's eyes with delight, and for those brief moments, Margaery could almost forget the harsh realities looming. She made sure to cultivate a few similarly gentle moments for Tywin as well. An evening where the three of them shared a quiet vigil by the fire, the infant dozing in Margaery's arms while Tywin sat close by, not quite relaxed but certainly less burdened by the weight of the realm. However, the day came when news arrived that the Ironborn, under Euron's command, had launched a brazen assault on a Lannister outpost at Fair Isle. Tywin heard it from a breathless courier who had ridden hard. According to the report, Euron's ships had struck swiftly by night, ravaging the port and burning half a dozen merchant vessels anchored there. Casualties among the defenders were significant, and the raiders had melted away as dawn broke. The devastation was enough to send a tremor of alarm through the Westerlands. Tywin, in response, immediately ordered the royal fleet to set sail from King's Landing. Command was given to a seasoned admiral named Ser Jorah Thornwell, with instructions to link up with Tyrell vessels near the mouth of the Mander. The combined force was to sweep northward along the coast, flush out the Ironborn, and if possible, capture Euron's flagship. Margaery watched as ships laden with soldiers, siege weapons, and archers left the capital's harbor. The sight of those proud red sails, alongside the green banners of Highgarden, filled her with a mix of hope and dread. She wished them well but braced herself for the grim possibility that not all would return. In the midst of these war preparations, a hush fell over the court when word reached them that a significant portion of the Vale's nobility had traveled to the Eyrie for an important council with Peter Baelish. Rumors abounded. Was he seeking to marry Lady Lisa Arryn's son to some great heiress? Was he planning to muster the Vale's knights for a campaign of his own design? No one could say for certain, but Baelish's talent for sowing confusion served him well. Tywin, having no immediate intention to provoke the Vale, simply kept watch. One more factor in an increasingly crowded web of potential conflicts. Then came a near tragedy in King's Landing itself. One frosty morning, Margaery was walking in the courtyard with Tywin, clutched close in her arms, swaddled in thick blankets, when a crossbow bolt hissed through the air, narrowly missing them and striking the stone wall behind her. A jarring, metallic clang echoed, and the cry of alarm soared across the courtyard. The guards reacted instantly, half of them rushing to protect Margaery, the others scrambling to find the attacker. Tywin, startled by the sudden chaos, began wailing, and Margaery's heart pounded as she hunched protectively over him. Confusion reigned for several minutes as the guards tracked footprints on the rooftop. A single crossbow was found discarded near a crenellation overlooking the courtyard. The would-be assassin was nowhere to be seen. Shaken but outwardly composed, Margaery allowed Ser Balman to escort her and the baby back inside. Tywin, alerted at once, arrived in a fury. His expression was grim as he ordered a sweep of the entire Red Keep, demanding answers as to how an assailant had gotten so close. Hours of investigation produced scant leads. The crossbow was of common manufacture, with no telling sigil or mark. A piece of torn cloak was discovered snagged on a spike, but no heraldry could be identified. Whether the attacker had been an agent of Stannis, Euron, a spurned house offended by Margaery's ascendancy, or some disgruntled local was impossible to determine. The only certainty was that the shot had been deliberate, aimed in Margaery's direction as she crossed the courtyard. The incident rattled the fortress. Cersei, for her part, made no public statement but was seen walking the halls in a contemplative mood, a faint smile occasionally tugging her lips, as though the disruption somehow pleased her. Tyrion cursed the failure of the castle's security and pledged to investigate personally. Olenna Tyrell was livid, threatening to unleash her own brand of retribution on any who dared endanger her granddaughter. Guards were doubled around Margaery's chambers, and Tywin was moved to a more secure nursery adjacent to Tywin's rooms. For his part, Tywin confronted the master-at-arms, the commander of the Gold Cloaks, and various household officers, demanding to know what lapses allowed such a threat. With each stumbling explanation, he grew angrier. Eventually, he relieved one of the watch captains of duty, citing incompetence. Then, in a private moment, he turned to Margaery in their chambers, voice low. "I will not allow any harm to come to you or our son. If we must root out every rat in this city, I shall do it." She nodded, still holding Tywin close. "I fear what might happen if these attempts continue. Joffrey once had an assassin aim for me, or so the rumors said, before we were even wed. But this felt different, more calculated. Someone bided their time, waiting for the perfect shot." Tywin's eyes hardened, and they missed. "Their next attempt will not come so easily. I have men loyal only to me scouring every corner of the castle. We'll find the culprit, or at least ensure they cannot repeat their folly." The attempt on Margaery's life served as a grim reminder that while armies waged war at sea, the greatest threats in King's Landing often came from within. Rumors multiplied. Some said it was Cersei herself, driven by jealousy. Others whispered that it was a jealous minor lord who'd once coveted Margaery. A few even suggested that it was an Ironborn agent, a prelude to sabotage from within the city. The official investigation found no conclusive evidence, only further shadows in the labyrinth of the Red Keep. While Tywin handled the fallout, Margaery tried to remain calm for Tywin's sake. She could not barricade herself away, for that would show weakness and erode her influence. Instead, she resumed her public duties, albeit with an expanded escort that never left her side. She addressed the courtiers and continued her charitable works with the faith, carefully projecting an image of dignity and resilience. She wanted the city to see that House Tyrell and House Lannister remained strong, unbowed by cowardly attempts at murder. A few days later, as though to compound the tension, a raven arrived bearing news from the Western Fleet. They had engaged the Ironborn in a series of running skirmishes, each side testing the other with feints and raids. Casualties mounted on both sides. The main conflict had yet to occur, but the message indicated that Euron's flagship, the ominously named Silence, was rumored to be prowling the waters, capturing or sinking smaller vessels. Morale in the fleet was strained. The Tyrell captains pressed for an all-out engagement. The Lannister commanders preferred caution, mindful that Euron might be laying a trap. Disagreement among the allied forces threatened to undermine their cohesion. Tywin read this dispatch with a glower, pacing behind his desk. Margaery stood by the window, Tywin in the arms of a nurse a few paces away. She heard Tywin mutter about arrogance and short-sighted aggression. "I specifically told them to coordinate their efforts. If the Tyrell admiral thinks he can rush in for glory, he risks dividing the fleet." Margaery's voice was calm. "The Tyrells have always prided themselves on swift action. Perhaps we can send a message urging them to maintain formation until a more unified strike can be launched." Tywin nodded, returning to the table to compose another series of urgent letters. He outlined a plan to concentrate the Allied ships at a strong defensive point near the coast, forcing Euron to either avoid them or come to them on less favorable terms. Meanwhile, smaller contingents could patrol the deeper waters, ensuring the Ironborn could not slip behind them undetected. It was not a flashy tactic, but it might draw Euron into a decisive confrontation if he grew bold. Before the letters could even be dispatched, another raven arrived, this one marked with the seal of House Redwine. Its contents were brief but alarming. The Redwine admiral reported that Euron had raided a small island fortress near the arbor, leaving it ablaze. More worrying was that the only survivors described Euron's men as chanting strange phrases about a drowned god's blessing, and that Euron himself wore a bizarre crown of black metal set with shards of deep green stone. The descriptions verged on the fantastical, but they confirmed that Euron was playing to the Ironborn's darkest superstitions, possibly emboldening them to fight with reckless ferocity. Tywin, after reading the letter, passed it silently to Margaery. She scanned the words, feeling a cold dread coil in her stomach. While she was not one for superstition, she understood the power of fervor. If Euron had managed to convince his followers that he was chosen by their savage deity, Then he commanded a unity among them that might stand against even a superior force. "He's going to drive them into a frenzy," she murmured, looking at Tywin. "They'll fight like zealots." Tywin's expression was grim. "Zealots can be broken so long as we remain disciplined. But we must be careful not to underestimate the effect this might have on their morale." Margaery's thoughts flashed to what she knew of the faith of the Seven. Religious devotion in times of conflict could yield miracles or atrocities, depending on one's perspective. If the Ironborn now believed they were on some holy quest, the war at sea would grow far bloodier. She felt a pang of sorrow for the sailors who would soon be forced into these brutal engagements. But sorrow could not quell the necessity of containing Euron's threat. She only hoped the combined fleets would remain united. As she stood there, Tywin fussed in the nurse's arms, perhaps sensing the tension in the room. Margaery went to her son, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. Her heart ached to think of him growing up in a land perpetually threatened by warlords and reavers. She had to trust that Tywin's strategies and her own diplomatic finesse could eventually steer the realm into a safer harbor. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Winter's gray gloom hung over King's Landing, pressing in on the city. Bells tolled faintly from some distant spire, perhaps heralding a funeral or a call to prayer. It was a city of ceaseless motion, a swirl of rumors and ambitions and secrets, where alliances were as fleeting as a sparrow's flight. In the weeks that followed, messages from the Western campaign arrived sporadically. Tense standoffs, minor clashes, the rumor of Euron's ships lurking just beyond sight. Each day carried a new bit of incomplete information. Tywin, pacing the war room, commented that if Euron refused a pitched battle, it might be best to blockade the Iron Islands themselves. The Tyrell commanders, however, were loath to commit to a drawn-out siege with winter's storms approaching. They wanted to draw Euron out and crush him quickly, then return home before supplies ran short. Torn between these approaches, the Allied fleet attempted a compromise. They advanced steadily, clearing each islet and coastal hideout they encountered, forcing Euron to either abandon them or fight. This strategy slowly reduced the Ironborn's ability to raid at will, but it did not land a decisive blow. Euron, cunning and slippery, always seemed to vanish with his core ships, striking in unexpected places. Each victory for the Allied fleet felt incomplete, overshadowed by the knowledge that the true menace remained at large. In King's Landing, Margaery continued to strengthen her ties with the small folk, the faith, and various courtiers. She knew the city was bracing for any sign of major conflict, either a naval defeat or an uprising by a new faction. The tension was nearly tangible, like a taut bowstring. Even the street musicians played somber tunes, and the bakers muttered about grain supplies if war dragged on. Against this backdrop of uncertainty, Margaery's presence, and her child, became emblematic of a hoped-for future. A child of two great houses, who might one day reign in a realm free of constant strife. By the time the new year crept in, a cautious optimism flickered in the capital. The Allied fleet had not yet delivered a crushing blow to Euron, but he had been prevented from conducting the full-scale raids many had feared. The rumor was that his Ironborn were growing impatient or hungry, or perhaps both. More ships from the north, ironically, had started patrolling the coasts near Flint's Finger and Bear Island, staving off any possibility of Ironborn encroachment there. Though the north was in turmoil under Bolton rule, some northern lords still refused to let their shores fall prey to the Ironborn. The realm's scattered actions, for once, seemed to align in pushing back against the reavers. Yet, on a particularly cold morning, a new twist emerged. Another raven arrived from the Stormlands, this time from Ser Garen Tarth. The letter was alarmingly concise. Stannis had dispatched an envoy to treat with key lords of the Stormlands, possibly to coordinate a renewed push on King's Landing. Ser Garen had heard rumors that Melisandre, the Red Priestess, planned something extraordinary to remove the false royals from power. Cryptic references abounded about sacrificing a king's blood and forging a shadow killer more powerful than anything seen before. Tywin, upon reading this, scoffed at the notion of shadow killers, though he retained a degree of wariness after hearing the tales from the Blackwater of how Renly Baratheon met his end. Margaery recalled that tragedy well. Though she had not witnessed it herself, the stories of an otherworldly shadow slaying Renly in his tent had circulated widely. Many dismissed it as superstition or rumor, but those who had been close to Renly swore it was the work of dark magic. Now, if Melisandre was intent on unleashing a similar horror upon King's Landing, they could not afford to simply dismiss it as nonsense. Stannis' ambition, combined with Euron's raids, threatened to form the dreaded two-front conflict Tywin had wanted to avoid. He convened the small council, including Margaery, to discuss how best to meet the threat. Varys, ever the spider, hinted that more than a few of Stannis' new adherents were fanatics who burned the old god's icons, forcing local Stormlands villages to convert to the Lord of Light. Tyrion rolled his eyes at the madness of religious war. Pycelle, trembling with age, recommended reinforcing the gates and walls of the city. Through it all, Margaery felt her pulse quicken, remembering how close Stannis had come to toppling them before. If the capital fell, or if Tywin was forced to withdraw troops from the west to defend the city, Euron might seize the opportunity to rampage unchecked. Balanced precariously, the realm once again hovered on the brink of chaos. In private, Tywin confided in Margaery that he might have to recall a portion of the fleet if Stannis' threat grew more imminent. "We cannot afford to let King's Landing stand undefended," he said, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced their solar. "But if we do so, Euron might slip through and devastate the Westerlands. We're stretched thin." Margaery looked at their infant son, sleeping soundly in a cradle near the fireplace. She felt a wave of determination. "We must find a way to keep both threats in check. Perhaps the Tyrells can commit more ground forces to the Stormlands, pressuring any lords there who might be wavering. Meanwhile, the Redwyne fleet can maintain pressure on Euron, buying us time." Tywin nodded. "I'll write to Mace Tyrell again, urging him to show greater force in the Stormlands. He's been content to guard the Reach thus far, but I need him to take action. If Stannis' rebellion is quashed decisively, we can refocus on the Ironborn. Or vice versa." She agreed, though she knew Mace's vanity might require coddling. She also suspected that, behind the scenes, Olenna Tyrell would ensure that Mace did not bungle the negotiations. There was still the question of how far the Tyrells would commit to an offensive war. Defending their homeland was one thing. Launching campaigns in the Stormlands was another, especially with winter deepening. In a cruel twist of fate, nature added another complication. A series of fierce winter storms lashed the coast, making seafaring more treacherous and impeding communications between the Crown's fleets. Ravens got lost in the torrential winds, supply ships were delayed, and more than one small vessel was wrecked on the rocks. The storms gave Euron a potential advantage. His Ironborn were reputed to be better sailors in rough seas, well-versed in the ways of wind and wave. For several nail-biting weeks, no definitive news reached King's Landing about the main fleet's situation. Then, in the midst of a windy evening, a heavily damaged Lannister galley limped into Blackwater Bay. Its captain, half-frozen and covered in bandages, staggered off the ship to deliver a first-hand account. The Allied fleet had finally confronted Euron near the rocky straits south of Fair Isle. The battle had been brutal. Euron's ships, employing cunning maneuvers and possibly aided by the storms, had managed to sink or disable several Allied vessels. In turn, the Allied fleet had inflicted heavy casualties on the Ironborn. The outcome was inconclusive. Both sides withdrew to lick their wounds. But the cost was high. The captain admitted that morale had suffered a blow, especially when Euron's flagship, Silence, had torn through the lines with unsettling ferocity. The next day, word also arrived that Mace Tyrell had assembled a host and marched into the Stormlands, taking several minor keeps by surprise and securing some key roads. Stannis, however, was rumored to have retreated deeper into the mountains, or perhaps even back to Dragonstone, refusing open battle. There were no signs yet of Melisandre's prophesied horrors, though the rumor mill churned ceaselessly. Tywin processed both sets of news, eyes narrowed in calculation. So, the Ironborn remain a threat at sea, but they're weakened. Stannis' forces are scattered, yet he refuses to yield. Neither foe is defeated, but neither has gained ground. He let out a rare sigh, shoulders tense under his crimson doublet. This is a war of attrition, and the realm can ill afford it. At that moment, Margaery experienced a surge of clarity. She realized how delicate their position truly was. The realm, so recently unified under the Lannister-Tyrell banner, was now being pulled in multiple directions. If Euron seized one decisive victory at sea, the Westerlands might lose its wealth and trade routes. If Stannis found a way to harness fear or magic to strike at King's Landing, the seat of power could fracture from within. And all the while, the small folk, battered by winter and haunted by memories of the last war, carried on, praying that someone would bring them lasting peace. Margaery resolved to do more than simply stand by. Over the next few days, she conferred with Olenna, who had her own network of informants, gleaning bits of intelligence from across the Stormlands and even Essos. Olenna's well-placed contacts in the Free Cities reported that some of Euron's men had been spotted in Lys, rumored to be negotiating for Selsale reinforcements. This revelation alarmed Margaery. If Euron was expanding his forces with foreign mercenaries, the allied fleet might soon be outnumbered. In a bold move, Margaery suggested to Tywin that they temporarily loosen the crown's purse strings to hire their own sell-sails or privateers who operated out of the Stepstones. "We could instruct them to harass Euron's supply lines," she proposed. "Keep his overseas dealings in check, maybe even cut off any new recruits. It's a risk, but it might pay off." Tywin considered the idea, weighing the cost. Hiring mercenaries was always fraught with potential betrayal, but with the realm stretched so thin, a cunning approach might gain them the upper hand. After a lengthy discussion with Tyrion and the Master of Whisperers, Tywin approved the plan in principle, provided it was handled discreetly. He knew that open admission of hiring pirates to fight pirates could undermine the crown's moral standing, such as it was. But a covert operation might keep Euron pinned down. Simultaneously, Margaery advocated for more overtures to Dorne, hoping to secure at least a token fleet or a guarantee of neutrality. She penned letters to Prince Doran Martell, phrased with the utmost courtesy, acknowledging the grievances of the past while expressing hope for a more harmonious future. She reminded him that a realm torn by war could benefit no one, least of all the southernmost kingdom, which had often stood apart from the rest. Whether Doran would respond positively remained to be seen. Dorne was infamous for its patient grudges. Winter's icy grip on King's Landing tightened, the winds whistling across the battlements. Snow was uncommon in the capital, but a light dusting one morning left the city's rooftops pale and shivering. The illusions of serenity were thin indeed. Margaery felt the tension with each passing day, sensed it in how the guards stood a bit more rigid at the gates, how the small folk scurried indoors before dark. The attempted crossbow assassination lingered in her mind, fueling her caution. She avoided large crowds unless absolutely necessary, always mindful of where Tywin was. She stationed extra guards at the nursery door, though she tried not to let them appear too threatening to the maids. Tywin, though typically distant in personal matters, showed an increased protective streak. If Margaery ventured beyond the Red Keep, he insisted on a sizable escort, and he regularly inquired about Tywin's welfare. He seemed to accept that the realm's enemies would see the child as a potential hostage or target, a symbol that could be exploited or threatened. One day, while reviewing a stack of reports, Margaery found a short message from Loras Tyrell. Since joining the Kingsguard, Loras had not been as close to her as before, and Margaery missed his presence. He wrote that he remained ever watchful in the White Cloak, though Joffrey's cruelty tested his patience daily. Loras also mentioned that the tension within the Red Keep was palpable. He had overheard Cersei having another heated argument with Tywin about preserving the family's reputation and not letting that Tyrell girl overshadow us. Margaery could only sigh at the Queen Regent's antics, recognizing that Cersei's pride would continue to be a thorn in her side. Despite all these undercurrents of conflict, Margaery found fleeting relief in caring for Tywin, guiding his early development, and making sure each day he was surrounded by warmth and learning. She even brought in a gentle old septa from the Reach who could sing lullabies and teach the child small prayers of the Seven. Tywin raised no objection to this, so long as it did not become an overtly pious spectacle. Perhaps he saw value in having the child steeped in the faith to reinforce legitimacy in the eyes of the devout. As Tywin approached his first name day, Margaery proposed hosting a modest celebration in the Red Keep, a gathering that would not be so lavish as to appear insensitive to the realm's troubles, but enough to let the court see that House Lannister still had reason to rejoice. Tywin, cautious about public displays during a time of war, considered it briefly and agreed so long as the event was carefully controlled. Accordingly, Margaery arranged a small feast in the Queen's ballroom. Musicians played a gentle tune, and only select nobles were invited, those known to be loyal or essential to fostering unity. Golden roses adorned the tables in a nod to the child's Tyrell heritage, while Lannister crimson draperies framed the hall. Tywin, fussing at first, eventually calmed in his mother's arms and stared wide-eyed at the glittering surroundings. Tyrion made a wry toast, commending the child for surviving his first year in King's Landing. No small feat, as he put it, drawing a ripple of uneasy laughter. Cersei sipped her wine with a thin smile, offering a stiff toast that underscored her ambivalence. Joffrey was conspicuously absent, citing urgent business in his chambers that doubtless involved tormenting someone. Olenna, however, was in fine form, planting herself beside Margaery and Tywin, throwing barbed compliments at any Lannister or Tyrell who dared approach. Tywin hovered near the dais, exchanging curt pleasantries with guests. Every so often, his gaze fell upon Margaery and Tywin. There was something in his expression, an almost imperceptible pride, that made Margaery's heart lighten. She thought back to when their marriage had been proposed, how she had accepted the arrangement for the good of her house and for her own ambition, never suspecting that she might find genuine respect for this stern patriarch. Yet here they stood, forging a precarious but powerful partnership, both aware that the realm's future might hinge on their unity. Even as the minstrels played on and wine flowed, Margaery's mind wandered to the fleets battling in the west, to the Stormlands teetering under Stannis' ephemeral threat, to the cunning of Peter Baelish in the Vale, and the unsettled north under Bolton rule. She recalled also the rumors of Daenerys Targaryen in Essos, her dragons growing larger, her army more disciplined. All these forces swirled beyond the Red Keep's walls, any one of which might upend their careful plans if fortune tilted. Still, in that moment, with Tywin safe in her arms and Tywin standing a short distance away, she found a brief respite. The gilded chandeliers flickered overhead, casting dancing lights upon the walls. The guests smiled through the uncertain times, feigning the cheer that the occasion demanded. For a few hours, the Red Keep felt almost serene, as though celebrating not just the first year of a child's life, but the very idea that hope could exist in a land so often ravaged by war. The feast concluded without incident, and by the next morning, the urgent press of Realpolitik returned. More letters, more councils, more decisions that would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Yet Margaery remained steadfast, bolstered by Tywin's clear sense of purpose and her own carefully nurtured web of alliances. She reminded herself daily that none of this could be taken for granted. Every day was a dance with chaos. One misstep, one misjudgment, and their hopes could collapse. In the weeks that followed, the Allied fleet gradually regained momentum, cornering Euron's forces in a series of engagements that left several Ironborn ships scuttled and forced Euron to retreat to the Iron Islands. Stannis' partisans in the Stormlands were routed or driven into hiding by Mace Tyrell's host, though no one knew if Stannis himself was truly beaten. The realm was not yet at peace, but a weary stalemate emerged, giving King's Landing and its inhabitants the slightest chance to breathe. Margaery and Tywin took that time to fortify their position, barricading the city against further infiltration, stabilizing the crown's finances, and reassuring the lords of the realm that House Lannister and House Tyrell stood as an unshakable bulwark. They received updates from the north, from the Vale, and from Dorne, each with its own swirl of intrigue. They carefully weighed which alliances to strengthen and which rivalries to keep contained. At the center of it all lay Tywin, the child in whom the future might unfold, if they could only keep the storms at bay long enough for him to grow. Thus, the cautious new era continued, shaped by the old lion's unyielding will and the young rose's earnest grace. Together, they navigated threats both foreign and domestic, forging a legacy that might yet defy the cycles of bloodshed. Each day they persevered was a testament to a marriage that had begun as a cold bargain yet blossomed into a formidable alliance. An alliance tested by shadows and steel, by storms at sea and treacheries at court, and which would, in time, face even greater trials in the endless Game of Thrones.